My name's Gareth Owen. I lead a research group at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's, called the Mental Health Ethics and Law Research Group. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Nuala Kane. Nuala is a psychiatrist. She's a higher trainee in psychiatry at the South London and Waterley NHS Trust, and an MD Res student at King's. And she has a project on mental capacity, which is, I think, probably a concept that is familiar to people, very familiar to people now, because it's been made familiar by the Mental Capacity Act. It's an area where mental health or psychiatry is meeting law and also ethics. And there are a range of issues, from policy ones to quite theoretical issues, but also, very importantly, practical issues. And this kind of research that Nuala's been doing has the potential to impact on practitioners, the clinicians of all kinds, but also judges. So it's an area of research that's going in lots of different directions. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Nuala.
Okay, great. Okay, good. That's the first challenge over. Yeah, thanks very much, Gareth. So as Gareth said, I'm focusing on mental capacity and specifically contested and complex capacity assessments. And so I'm in a part-time MD Res, and as Gareth mentioned, I'm also in my final year of higher training and working in liaison and perinatal psychiatry. And for me, the interest in capacity very much came from my clinical practice. And actually, it's interesting, even yesterday as working in liaison psychiatry, I was asked to assess capacity for somebody with a psychotic disorder who was refusing antibiotics for a very serious infection. And I think these kind of questions come up, and they really can be really challenging for clinicians. And so I suppose part of my research is about looking at what we can learn from the most difficult capacity assessments, where there's some contest, where there's disagreement, or where there's complexity, and what we can learn, what practitioners essentially can learn from looking at those particular types of assessments. So capacity is really a medical legal construct. So you know, it's defined in the law, in the Mental Capacity Act in England and Wales, and court practice in the Court of Appeal, in the Court of Protection, the High Court, really sort of determines, what we understand by capacity and how the Mental Capacity Act is understood. And yet it's really in the clinical setting or in health and social care settings where we actually apply these legal concepts. And I'm particularly interested in that sort of application process. So how do we move from something legal to something that is really essentially sort of clinically applied? And so just to remind people about what the Mental Capacity Act says about mental capacity in terms of how to assess it. So the Capacity Act says that you lack capacity, and it's decision specific and time specific, but you lack capacity in relation to a decision if you're unable to make that decision for yourself because of an impairment of or disturbance in the functioning of mind or brain. And it further specifies inability to make a decision as inability to understand, retain, use or weigh relevant information, or to communicate that decision. So essentially, the language of the law is quite clear, but what's not so clear is how you apply that to real life, to clinical practice. So there was a number of phases in my research, and I've presented on previous Scholars' Day on some of the sort of previous phases of the study. So I initially was involved in doing an audit, looking at these kind of dispute cases, so where a judge was called upon to resolve disagreements about whether somebody had capacity for a specific decision or did not. And we were really looking at, how the judges grappled with these issues and whether they sort of met the standards that were in the law themselves in terms of thinking about whether the person had been supported, for example, in terms of citing specific inabilities like use or weigh or understanding that were at play in that particular case. We then, I'm not able to move on. Oh, okay. Sorry. We then moved on to a broader study. So I led on a content analysis, and I presented this last year. So I looked at all of the judgments published on capacity over a 10-year period, which was 131, and looked in detail on how the judges and the expert witnesses, primarily psychiatrists, were actually justifying or giving a rationale for why a person was felt to have capacity or lack capacity. And I then sort of made a typology of these kind of rationales. And the idea was that the application of capacity law would become more transparent, more accountable, and more clear, and that we would be able to look at specific areas of decision-making ability or inability so that support could be targeted more specifically in terms of decision-making support. So the third phase is the one I wanted to talk about today. And so as well as looking at the court documents, we felt it was really important to talk to practitioners themselves, and particularly liaison psychiatrists. So I'm going to come to that a little bit later. And then the fourth part is educational intervention or educational materials. And so I was involved, I designed a masterclass session on complex capacity assessment, which was delivered to practitioners across the UK, and some travelled from outside the UK as well. Obviously, this was pre-COVID times, but that was looking at applying the research or essentially translating the research into some educational materials. But I wanted to talk today about the interviews with liaison psychiatrists, because this is really what I'm looking at the moment. And I was lucky in that I was able to do the actual interviews prior to COVID, because I had a protected research time in the first year of my MD Res, although because we interviewed professionals in Scotland and New Zealand as well, some of these were actually remote. So yeah, I do have a real sympathy for the people who are you know, carrying out remote studies at the moment, because it's not always easy, of course. So in general, the aim of the study is to identify and describe clinical and ethical factors which make some capacity assessments more difficult than others. And we specifically focused on liaison psychiatrists because they're often considered to be the capacity experts. So liaison psychiatrists, for those who don't know, work in a general hospital setting. So they essentially work on a consultation basis. So medics and surgeons who have inpatients or outpatients about which they're concerned about their mental health will then refer to liaison psychiatrists for their psychiatric expertise. But it's not always pure psychiatry, and often it's because there might be a particular concern about somebody's capacity to make a decision around their medical treatment, for example, or around discharge planning, and it may be felt that there's an impairment of mind or brain, you know, for example, but not always, a mental disorder, which is interfering with that decision-making process. And these decisions can be very high stakes in hospital, so it can be life or limb, life or death situation. So I interviewed 29 liaison psychiatrists, England, Scotland, and a couple from New Zealand as well. And we wanted to go across jurisdictions because I suppose capacity in practice, although obviously we're bound by the law, you know, the people we see are not bound by the law. So the, you know, the same clinical issues are coming up across jurisdictions. So we thought that would be interesting. And so what I'm currently doing is, I'm involved in a theme, or I'm doing a thematic analysis of the interview transcripts. And the idea is that I'll be able to pick out themes in relation to what makes certain capacity assessments more difficult, and use sort of text excerpts and case vignettes to highlight these. And I've done a little warning, which is that the work is still in progress. So I've got through about 15 of the 29 transcripts at the moment. But what I'm going to do is just talk through the study in a bit of, you know, the process of the study, to give you an idea about the interview study, and then to give you sort of preliminary schematic results that have come from the analysis. So the first step was recruitment, and this was really sort of interesting because it was an international recruitment. So as well as sending lots of, you know, emails and like, you know, accessing the liaison psychiatry mailing list and all these things, we also had the opportunity. So I gave a talk with my supervisor in Scotland to recruit liaison psychiatrists in Scotland, and we also had to, you know, discuss with contacts in New Zealand as well. we then came up with an interview protocol. So I wrote this protocol and then got like a lot of sort of feedback, both from colleagues, psychiatrists, as well as our service user advisory group, which was very helpful. And we really looked at what did we want to know about these sort of capacity assessments, about the person whose capacity was being assessed, about the type of decision, and the crux of the issue. This was probably my favorite question. So what actually made this particular capacity assessment really difficult? If there was disagreement, why was there disagreement? So those kind of questions to try to get to the bottom of what the difficulty was.
Nuala, just to say, I think we may not have time for questions. You've got 3 minutes
okay.
before we
I've got 3 minutes.
automatically return. Just
okay.
to let you know.
Oh, sorry. Very good. Oh no. So just very briefly then to look at this. So why are some capacity assessments more challenging? So this is kind of results we were coming up with. Some factors were relating to the person, to the subject of assessment in terms of whether an impairment was driving their decision making. Some related to actually the assessor and what values or even societal values they were sort of channeling into the assessment. And some factors related to the decision itself in terms of how risky it was. So given that we've got limited time, I find this one particularly interesting. So difficult factors relating to the impairment in decision making, and maybe to just look at the quote at the top left. So actually the disagreement was partly held around the question of, is this person depressed, or is he making a decision that's perfectly understandable in the context of such a terminal serious illness? So this case was about somebody who was refusing to have dialysis, and the psychiatrist and the wider team were really struggling with whether this person was actually clinically depressed and so pessimistic therefore that they couldn't make the decision, or whether actually, you know, this was a reasonable and understandable decision that anybody might make in such difficult, you know, circumstances, the difficult life circumstances that they were in. So I think there's a lot of areas of complexity. I found that really fascinating to think about, you know, where that boundary lies between and sort of understandable decision in the context of the person's own values and circumstances versus where a mental health problem is actually interfering with that decision. So I can talk a bit more, but maybe it's better to leave some time for questions before we are moved out of the room. Would that be okay? So just to, yeah, mention we had our content analysis published this year, which we were delighted with. And despite COVID taking me away from academic time for a significant amount of time, I've also managed to do some teaching around decision-making capacity in COVID, which I really enjoyed doing.